What would you do if you bought a house, only to realize someone had been using it like it was theirs all along? That's exactly what happened to me. I thought I'd scored the deal of a lifetime, a 3-bedroom house in the heart of the city, well below market price. The previous owners, the Carter family, had been family friends who needed to sell fast. They hadn't lived in the country for years, so the place sat abandoned, mid-renovation, waiting for someone like me to bring it back to life. It needed work, sure, but I didn't mind. What I didn't expect was that the house had become part of the neighborhood's free-for-all territory. The first sign of trouble came on move-in day. As I pulled up with the last load of my stuff, I noticed a motorcycle parked inside my garage. Not mine. Not my friend's. Just sitting there like it belonged. At first, I thought maybe it was left behind by the previous owners, but no, this was someone else's. Annoyed but not looking for a fight, I pushed the bike out onto the street and went about my business. My first order of business? Installing a proper gate. The house had been sitting wide open for years, and I wasn't about to let strangers stroll through my property whenever they pleased. Later that evening, as I was unpacking, I heard banging on my newly installed gate. Slow, deliberate knocking. I glanced out the window. A man stood there, arms crossed, glaring at my house like I'd personally insulted him. He knocked again, harder this time. I had no interest in entertaining whatever entitled nonsense he had to say, so I didn't answer. Instead, I watched. After about 15 minutes of standing there, muttering to himself, he finally gave up, walked over to the bike, and rode off. That should have been my first warning sign that something was off about this neighborhood. But at the time, I brushed it off as a minor inconvenience. I had no idea this man, Earl, my neighbor, would become the thorn in my side that would nearly make me regret buying this house. It wasn't until a week later that I realized just how deep the entitlement in this neighborhood ran. The house was finally starting to feel like mine. I had fixed up some of the unfinished renovations, set up my home office, and was getting used to the sounds of the city at night. For the most part, things had settled down. That was, until one evening when I noticed something strange while taking a shower. The water pressure was weaker than usual, not alarmingly low, but just enough to feel off. At first, I thought it was a temporary issue with the supply, maybe city maintenance or an air bubble in the pipes. But then I heard a low hum through the bathroom wall, something mechanical. I hadn't paid attention before, but now that I was listening, I recognized the sound. It was a water pump. More specifically, my neighbor's water pump. I stood there, shampoo still in my hair, feeling that creeping suspicion crawl up my spine. Water pumps weren't unusual in my city, they were a necessity for multi-story buildings because the public water supply didn't have enough pressure to reach rooftop tanks. But why did my pressure drop only when his pump was running? It was too much of a coincidence. After finishing my shower, I decided to run a test. I waited until the humming stopped, signaling that his pump had shut off. Then, I turned on the bathroom faucet. Full pressure. Kitchen sink. Full pressure. Backyard hose. Full pressure. Then I waited, listening. A few minutes later, I heard the pump click on again. The moment I did, I turned the faucet back on. Weak flow. That son of a, he was stealing my water. I clenched my jaw, trying to make sense of it. The house had been empty for nearly 3 years, and the previous owners had mentioned their water bills were rising before they left. They had assumed it was just leaks from old pipes. But now? It was obvious. At some point, Earl had figured out that the house was unoccupied and decided to help himself. I needed to be sure before taking action. Over the next few days, I tested it multiple times, at different hours, on different taps. The result was always the same: when his pump turned on, my pressure dropped. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a direct connection. But the real shock came when I decided to check my main utility panel. I wanted to see if there were any strange modifications to my water lines. What I found instead made my blood run cold. Tucked behind a loose section of my property's electrical conduit, I saw something that should not have been there, a secondary power cable running underground toward Earl's house. My stomach dropped. He wasn't just stealing my water. He was stealing my electricity too. I stood there staring at the underground power cable, my pulse pounding in my ears. Water theft was one thing, but electricity? That was a whole new level of bold. Earl had gone beyond just siphoning off a little extra water from a vacant house. He had illegally wired his home into my electrical system, meaning that for who knows how long, I had been unknowingly footing the bill for both his water and his power. A slow, seething rage settled in my chest. I wasn't the kind of person to go knocking on doors and screaming accusations, but I also wasn't about to let this slide. Earl had clearly been helping himself to free utilities for years, banking on the fact that the house had been sitting empty and that no one would bother to check. And now that I lived here, he probably thought I was too stupid to notice. I could have confronted him, sure. I could have called the police or reported him to the utility company. But that wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel it. That night, I devised a plan that was simple, legal, and absolutely devastating. The next morning, I waited until I heard the familiar hum of Earl's water pump kicking on. I walked outside, went straight to my main utility valve, and shut off my water supply at the source. Then I went back inside, made a cup of coffee, and waited. Within minutes, his pump started straining, the motor whirring louder than usual. See, the way our water systems worked was pretty straightforward. When a pump doesn't get enough water, it keeps running, trying to compensate. And if it keeps running without water for too long, it burns out. I could already picture him standing in his house, fiddling with knobs, trying to figure out why his free water wasn't coming through. I let it go for an hour before I heard something even more interesting, a loud pop, followed by complete silence. I had just fried his water pump. But the best part? That was only the beginning. What I hadn't expected was how much his outdated wiring would backfire on him. The constant strain from his pump drew more and more power, overloading his entire electrical system. By 3 a.m., his whole house went dark. The shouting started soon after. I lay in bed, eyes closed, listening to the beautiful sound of his tenants screaming at him. They were furious, no water, no power, no explanation. By the next day, his tenants had had enough. One of them stormed out with packed bags, saying he wasn't paying another cent to live in a house where the landlord couldn't keep the utilities running. The other one filed an official complaint with the police. And here's the thing about tenant laws in my city: landlords are legally required to maintain essential services like water and electricity. If they fail to do so, they get fined. Earl, the cheap, entitled thief who had been living off my resources for years, was about to pay a much higher price than just his fried pump. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the entire neighborhood knew something had gone terribly wrong at Earl's house. His tenants were furious, pacing in front of the building, talking loudly on their phones, and swearing up a storm about their landlord's incompetence. The power was still out. The water was still off. Earl, who was usually quick to complain about anything and everything, had gone eerily silent. He must have realized he was in deep trouble. I kept my distance, playing the part of the completely uninvolved neighbor, sipping my coffee as I watched from my window. Then, around midday, the police showed up. I wasn't the only one watching. Other neighbors peered from their windows, some stepping outside to get a better look. Earl stood at his doorway, arms crossed, jaw clenched, trying to play it cool. But even from a distance, I could see the sweat on his forehead. The officers talked to the remaining tenant, Sarah, who gestured wildly at the house, pointing at the dead light fixtures, the useless taps, and the general state of disrepair. When one of the officers pulled out a ticket book, I knew it was over for him. a hefty fine was coming. But something about this whole situation still didn't sit right with me. How had Earl gotten so comfortable stealing from a property he didn't own? How had he walked into my house's plumbing and electrical system like it was his own? And why did he act like he had some unspoken authority over the neighborhood? I needed answers. That afternoon, I started asking around. I figured the older residents, people who had lived here longer than me, might know something about Earl's past. And sure enough, after a few conversations with some chatty neighbors, I uncovered the real reason Earl acted like he owned this street. Years ago, he had been part of the neighborhood HOA. Not just any member, one of the board directors. Back then, he and a handful of others had run the place like a dictatorship. They handed out ridiculous fines for the smallest things, a mailbox slightly tilted? That's a $50 violation. Grass 2 inches taller than regulation? Another $75. They would collect fees under the excuse of neighborhood maintenance, but never actually did anything to improve the area. Then, one day, a few homeowners had enough. They started digging into the HOA's finances and found out Earl and his buddies had been pocketing most of the money. There had been lawsuits, an official investigation, and eventually, the entire HOA was dissolved. Earl had managed to avoid jail time, but his reputation was ruined. But here's the thing, Earl never stopped acting like the HOA was still in power. Even after the HOA was gone, he kept trying to control the neighborhood like he still had authority. He bullied new homeowners, pressured sellers into choosing buyers he approved of, and used whatever dirty tricks he could to make people's lives difficult. That's why he had been so furious when the Carter family sold me this house. He thought he had some right to decide who moved in. And now? Now I had solid proof that he wasn't just a miserable old man with a bad attitude, he was a full-blown con artist who had been getting away with this for years. It was time to make sure that everyone knew exactly who he was. Earl's downfall was swift and brutal. The fines from the police hit him hard, $500 for failing to maintain essential utilities for his tenants, plus the legal obligation to refund their security deposits. With no power or water, both tenants packed up and left, vowing never to rent from him again. And just like that, Earl lost his only source of income. But his problems didn't stop there. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and the neighborhood started talking. People who had been here for years, former victims of his HOA schemes, began coming forward, sharing their own stories. Stories of bogus fines, intimidation tactics, and backdoor deals where Earl had tried to control who bought homes in the area. The final blow came when he tried to sell his house. With burned-out wiring, no working water system, and a damaged reputation, no one wanted to buy it, not at market price, anyway. The property sat on the market for months, its value dropping lower and lower until he had no choice but to auction it off for a fraction of what it was worth. And who was waiting to buy it? Me. The irony was almost too perfect. Earl had spent years acting like he ran this neighborhood, stealing from me and everyone else. And in the end, I owned his house. But I didn't buy it to live in, I had a much better plan. I turned it into a dog rescue center, filling it with the very animals Earl had once complained about. Now, every time he walks past, he sees happy, barking dogs instead of a house he used to control. With nowhere else to go, he moved in with his daughter, Lisa, who, after hearing the truth, wanted nothing to do with him. He was a disgraced, penniless old man, left with nothing but the bitter knowledge that his own arrogance had destroyed him. In the end, karma handled everything. I never had to raise my voice, never had to step into a courtroom or file a single complaint. I just let him dig his own grave, one entitled decision at a time. But it makes me wonder, how many people like Earl are still out there, bullying their way through life, convinced they can get away with anything? Have you ever had to deal with a HOA nightmare or an entitled neighbor like this? Share your experiences below. I want to hear just how bad it can get.